Good afternoon. Welcome all of you who joined us. Media Center Ukraine in Ukrinform starts its work. It's the 9th year of the war, and it's the 166th day since the full-fledged invasion. I'm grateful to everyone who tells the truth about this war. And thanks to you, this truth could find people in any corner of the earth. So today, at 2:30 we have Natalia Gumenyuk, the Coordination Press Center of the Southern Commands. We'll be discussing operational situation in the south of the country. Now we have Yuriy Poita, the head of the Pacific sector of the Center for Army Conversions and Disarmament Studies. Today we're going to be talking the bilateral China-Ukraine relations. So, Yuriy, we know that from the beginning of the full-fledged invasion, the president of Ukraine did not have direct contacts with the leader of China. And we are also aware that such contacts our president would like to have. And if we quote him, he stated that it would be beneficial for both countries. So what's happening now, and what could we be expecting looking forward? Good afternoon. The relevance of this topic is extremely important, especially in the context of the Ukrainian-Russian war. And there are a couple of issues here. China is the leading economy, the leading player of the world, the permanent member of the UN Security Council. Also, China, according to a number of Ukrainian-Chinese documents, is qualified as a strategic partner for Ukraine, namely documents signed in 2011 and 13 state that. So Ukraine has friendly relations with China, especially on a number of issues related to agriculture and military technical cooperation. So at the first glance, China is supposed to have a pro-Ukrainian position, providing assistance to Ukraine. On the other hand, we heard statements that when Ukraine started creating new architecture with new security guarantees would help Ukraine in that and thus impact the Russian Federation. And this is how President Zelensky is trying to get in touch with the leader of China, Xi Jinping, requesting his assistance in influencing the Russian Federation. But it's not happening. We cannot see any serious steps of the Chinese People's Republic towards Ukraine. We're trying to figure out what are the reasons for that and how to build the relations for Ukraine with the Chinese People's Republic. So what's the current status quo? The strategic documents of 2011 and 13, like I said, as of 2019, China became the biggest trade partner, $14.5 billion US, thus China becoming the biggest country Ukraine exports into. Also, China was always treated by the Ukrainian authority positively as a source of investments, the driver for economic growth. There were lots of statements that China is a global investor, interested in building one belt, one way projects, building industrial parks, joint ventures, railways, infrastructure. But we're not observing this. Looking at the Ukrainian Statistics Committee, $20 to $30 million investments into Ukrainian economy, 2015 through 2019. In total, that's $127. That's 0.7% of all the investments into the economy of Ukraine, which means that China is not willing to invest into the Ukrainian economy, and the investments it made were made into two areas. Firstly, improving infrastructure to receive better access to the Ukrainian raw materials, and secondly, granting credits, often enough unfavorable to Ukraine, too expensive, and involved with corruption risks. Military and technical cooperation was one of the priority areas for cooperation. Let me remind you that the first aircraft carrier, Laulin, was built in Mykolaiv and shared with China. There were lots of maritime and aviation and rocket building spheres, but military technical area was riddled with the following problems. China was moving in one area, Ukraine was selling technologies, equipments, military armaments, but received nothing from China in terms of technology or armaments that Ukraine needed at that time. We're talking about 2008 and 9. Ukraine needed air defense means, missile systems, anti-rocket systems, but it never happened. Another problem was Motor Sich case. Located in Zaporizhzhia in 2016, China tried, outside of official channels of military technical cooperation, to receive access to this company, to its technologies. If it would only succeed, it would cause substantial risk to Ukrainian military security. The Neptune rocket that downed the Russian ship uses the motor design in Motor Sich. So, as of 2021, it became clear that China is no longer a friend of Ukraine, but it's not a foe either. It's a partner. And it's being quite accurately articulated by the Ukrainian authorities. But the Russian war changed everything. Now the position of China, most oftenly called by the experts as pro-Russian neutrality. What does it mean? It means that China, on the one hand, looks like supports the integrity, territorial integrity, independence, and security and sovereignty of Ukraine. But on the other hand, it carries out steps that are not favorable to Ukraine and are against our national interests. Namely, China votes consequently against Ukrainian resolutions in the Council of Europe and UN. China never criticizes the Russian actions in Ukraine. It always calls it this war as a Ukrainian crisis, stating that the Russian concerns in terms of Russia's security should be respected. That's what China says. That's exactly the ultimatum that Russia gave Ukraine before its full-fledged invasion. So, China believes that this war is all about NATO and the US. If you look at the discourse of the Chinese experts and politicians, the blame of the Ukrainian crisis and the food crisis is exclusively the court of NATO and the US in particular, which allegedly, because of their policy, were moving towards ease, thus provoking the Russian Federation. China always is against imposing sanctions against Russia, claiming that it doesn't help to prevent the conflict, only ruining economic relations in the world. China is against providing Ukraine with armaments. It keeps repeating this at all the events, claiming that the Western arms don't help to resolve the conflict, but bring oil to the fire. China disseminated Russia's dissemination about so-called 20 biolabs allegedly located in Ukraine to produce American chemical weapons and biological weapons. Ukraine is absent in the Chinese discourse. If we look at mass media in China, in Chinese and English, Ukraine is always treated as a zone of influence of the Russian Federation, which temporarily has been under control of the United States, so thus Russia is just protecting its interests. No discourse about the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian national interests, about the genocide in Bucha, about the fight of Ukraine for its independence, for the ability to set its own fate. It's absent in Chinese discourse. It's all about Russia fighting against US and Ukraine being a proxy. Now, the change of so-called pro-Russian neutrality could not be expected. No factors, no scenarios that would change this current Chinese position one way or another, which serves the Ukrainian purposes because China fails to provide Russia with any military assistance, and also is very cautious about helping Russia to avoid sanctions. So according to the Ukrainian authorities, Chinese position is more or less acceptable right now. I would not be covering the reasons for that, but what could Ukraine do now? The basic strategy is not to make an enemy out of China, not to make any efforts that would be treated as anti-Chinese. But Ukraine needs to become self-sufficient, reducing risks coming from China. Let me remind you that according to the EU strategy, according to the NATO strategy, approved a month ago, China is treated as a challenge to interests, values, and Atlantic security. So, if Ukraine strives to integrate UN, EU, and NATO, it needs to change its position towards China, because strategic partnership and on the one hand, and the challenge to the global security, well, it should not be labeling one and the same country. So Ukraine clearly needs to maintain trade relations with China, economic projects for sure, but we need to impose clear restrictions on cyber security area, on building by Huawei company 5G networks in Ukraine, because it caused substantial threats for sensitive information in Ukraine. Military technical cooperation, I believe, should be discontinued now, because we will get Lend-Lease for the total amount of 40 billion on the one hand, and $0 of assistance from Chinese People's Republic in terms of military support to Ukraine. So military technical cooperation with China could be aimed against national interests of the US, because strengthening the Chinese armed forces will strengthen concerns of our partners in Asian Pacific region. And also there is a number of other issues that I believe Ukraine should carry out certain steps, like the draft law on screening of foreign investments. This draft law has been designed, but it hasn't been imposed just yet. It follows the European practice. In the EU, it exists from 2019. If only we would have imposed it already, then the legislation on the screening of foreign investments in terms of how they threaten our national security, well, they would help to prevent us this motor siege case. Thank you. Your questions, please. Yuriy, look. The actions of our authorities look quite logical, to find ways to cooperate with the country that could one way or another impact the aggressor, the country we're fighting with. On the other hand, you are clearly stating that we can find the concerns of our strategic partners like US and other countries. So what should we do in this regard? Because if we implement all those tips, they might not be well accepted by our partners. So how should we try to not cross this line with China? Well, for quite a while we're trying to see how we're trying to communicate with China, but it fails to respond. If we look at the Chinese mass media, well, they reproduce and retranslate the pro-Russian narratives. Absolutely Russian media. 2016, Russian and Chinese media signed serious agreements on cooperation, and they have only intensified those efforts. Also, Russia and China coordinate their political position on the international arena. They clearly state that, no changes on that. So far, we've seen only 2 interviews from Dmytro Kuleba and a week ago, President Zelensky in Chinese media. I believe all measures are positive if only they help to change the Chinese position into becoming pro-Ukrainian. What do those two interviews in Chinese media tell us? Since President Zelensky communicates with Xi Jinping through mass media, it proves that diplomatic channels are not working. They cannot arrange elementary telephone call. It's not the official meeting, it's not about the state visit, it's just an elementary telephone call, and it cannot be arranged, and it's not Ukraine to blame. It's just China that fails to communicate in this case. So there are various ways how we can try keep doing it, but China tries not to make anything that Russia would not like. So China, for some reason, values its partnership with the Russian Federation. The discourse, the communications with the Chinese experts only prove that. So what could we do now? All the measures I have enumerated are not for our strategic partners. These are the measures that would strengthen the Ukrainian self-sufficiency in mid-term and long-term perspective. Right now, everything's happening at the battlefield, meaning that there are no Chinese-Ukrainian projects to speak of, but we recognize that in a year or two, and Ukraine will have to build new relations with the Chinese People's Republic, supporting the Ukrainian interests. So those interests have been implemented in the EU because as a result of the discussion, they have been found to be the most optimal for NATO purposes. So I believe Ukraine will have to reconsider its relations with the Chinese People's Republic. I don't believe it would lead to deterioration of our relations. Well, they will be weakened or put on pause, but that's quite normal when the country cooperates with certain country in one areas but closes down other areas. For instance, Ukraine cannot get access to the technologies of the People's Liberation Army of China. Well, it's not favorable for China, fine. Well, let's then Ukraine change its own approaches. How would you evaluate the opportunity that China will provide technical assistance to Russia? It's very little possible to happen. Here there are two basic ingredients: the military actions at the battlefield on the one hand, but Marines of Chinese armed forces will not end up in Black Sea. On the other hand, the second ingredient is providing arms and military equipment or its components. But there are no indications that China has transferred anything like that to Russia or is ready to transfer anything, which is being confirmed by very clear positions of Washington and Brussels, who claim at all the events that if only we would identify any sort of military technical assistance from China to the Russian Federation, it would ruin the relations of China with the US and EU. For China, it's extremely important to have access to the EU and US markets, which are much more substantial than that of Russia. And so China, trying to become a superpower, it has to have access to Western technologies. So military assistance to Russian Federation will ruin such relations and will pose under threat the ability of China to reach its strategic goals. Colleagues, questions? Ukrinform? A couple of questions. How high is the potential of China to change its position after the 20th session of the Communist Party? Secondly, what are the potential risks for Ukraine in the current environment of dangerous relations between China and the US? And thirdly, what's your take on the escalation of the conflict in Taipei? Thank you for this. Now, as to the 20th session of the Communist Party, most likely the current leader, Xi Jinping, would be re-elected. The Chinese People's Republic is a closed political regime. Any internal political discussions are confidential. Mass media receives only a dose of truth. It's not clear how they would shape their internal policy because we have no inputs to make such assessments. We can only base our evaluation on what's being published and the conclusions of the Chinese experts. So, based on their comments, they believe that after Xi Jinping is re-elected, China will continue the same political course that it had sustained over the last 10 years, namely reaching the status of superpower technologically, economically and military, and winning the strategic competition against the US. These are two strategic goals. That's why the 20th session of the Communist Party would not impact that. A couple of months ago, in one of the EU countries, they carried out a very substantial brainstorming having representatives of the EU and NATO looking at three scenarios: the military defeat of Russia, the military defeat of Ukraine, and thirdly, status quo scenario. Under all three scenarios, they thought what actions of China could be forecasted. According to the conclusions of this discussion, the actions of the, well, it's hard to be expected that China will change its actions. It will remain to be neutral, but pro-Russian neutral. There might be little regulations like buying more oil or selling chips to China, no more than that. Now, what would be the risks associated with the current tensions between China and the US? Well, quite a complicated question indeed. I believe for Ukraine the biggest military risk is the ongoing war with Russia. That's why any trade competition between US and China becomes secondary for us. But Ukraine might grasp some opportunities here. What do I mean by this? The military defeat of Ukraine will mean the geopolitical defeat of the West, which China would make use of. So the goal of China is to reach its geopolitical domination. That's why strategic competition between the US and China is positive, is beneficial for Ukraine, because the West has to support Ukraine. If Ukraine fails today, US will fail China in 15 to 20 years' time. Now, your third question, Taipei. The situation is tense, but currently it's more or less controlled. The military exercises of Chinese army is over. In Taipei Strait, there were 6 areas where those military exercises were conducted, including Chinese Navy launching ballistic missiles. About a dozen launches of Dunfen 15 ballistic missile, little range, up to 700 kilometers. A couple of those rockets flew over the territory of Taiwan, Taipei. Those 6 zones were closer than ever to Taipei. the third Taipei crisis of 1995-96, they also had a couple of areas for military exercise, I mean China, but this time around they even crossed the 12-mile maritime zone of Taipei, which is unprecedented. Also, the Chinese People's Republic is crossing the median line between Taipei and mainland China, an unofficial maritime border. But there is no escalation. The military exercises caused ships and aircraft to cross those lines, which happened before. How would the events evolve? The best people to know this are Chinese military commanders. But my Taipei contacts tell me that the probability of the military conflict between the US and China is very low. The probability of China invading Taipei is very low for a number of reasons, but I won't stop on them because it would take too much time to explain. And right now, China will be gradually decreasing the military escalation. It will be winding out the intensity of those military exercises. Well, some new exercises might be announced, of course, but in diplomatic and media spheres, the situation will remain to be quite acute. The US-Chinese relations will deteriorate substantially because of that. China will keep threatening Taipei with their strategy of gray zones, but the probability of military conflict right now is assessed to be of low probability. Thank you, Yuriy Poita. Thank you for such a conversation. Next briefing will happen at 2:30. We'll discuss the situation in the south of Ukraine. Stay with us. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.